briefly former President Trump's national security advisor, also is a big QAnon conspiracy proponent. General Mike Flynn has called Trewhella's book a masterful blueprint, something that basically every patriot should read. He's promoted it several times. Another one is Jenna Ellis, who was a member of Trump's 2020 campaign team, facing, I think she pleaded guilty. I'm not sure, but she, got into legal trouble for attempting to overturn the 2020 election. She cited it in a 2015 book, saying that this is a possible way to develop a moral constitution. And in her version, the book Moral Constitution meant one that did not endorse or enshrine gay marriage.
Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, I'm your political host, Will Wright, and your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram, is taking a much-needed vacation. But today we are very fortunate to have with us Phoebe Petrovic, who is a investigative reporter on a 2-year fellowship with ProPublica's local reporting network. She previously covered disinformation and democracy at Wisconsin Watch and was a 2022-23 Law and Justice Journalism Project Fellow. Petrovic also reported, produced, and hosted Open and Shut, a podcast series co-published with the Wisconsin Public Radio, and which examined the power of prosecutors. But today we are speaking with Phoebe about a really, really interesting story that we were just talking about before we hit record that really kind of adds a whole other layer to this intermingling between faith and politics. And we're so excited to have her on. So welcome to the show, Phoebe.
Thank you for having me.
So, I guess maybe before we kind of get into the weeds, like talk to us a little bit more about sort of, I guess, your journey as an investigative reporter. I'm always fascinated. Like I'm a big fan of folks that work in the media, especially that do kind of like investigative journalism. I feel like it's one of those like most underappreciated but most valuable jobs out there, kind of like being a teacher. So yeah, tell me about like your road to become an investigative reporter.
Yeah. It's funny. I have a good friend who our paths kind of totally crossed. In college, I very much wanted to be a radio maker, an audio storyteller, and he was like a hard news sort of person. And then at some point we diverged, and now he's a full-time like narrative podcast producer, and I'm an investigative reporter and want to do that. So it's kind of funny when we think about that. But I wanted to be an audio producer, a radio storyteller, but I also, I'm a big nerd who had a passion and knack for research and like meticulous organization, and lots of reading and synthesis. And so it just seemed like that was sort of the realm in which I could apply my skills. And then it just seemed really fun. And I tend to have a brain that like really focuses on the details and thinks about things for a long time. And so it just is sort of what I fell into. And I think I'm really drawn to the kind of values of it. Like there's a common set of values amongst all journalists, but then with investigative reporting particularly, so I have friends who are daily reporters who they're like, my job is to like chronicle the news of the day and what's happening, to sort of write that first draft of history. And I have the privilege to go a little bit deeper and really think about holding power to account and, bringing up things that people in power with vested interest don't want people to know about, and so the commitment to truth and justice and all those good things is embedded into the profession. So that's sort of what drew me to it.
I love that, and I love the fact that you're on a fellowship with ProPublica. ProPublica is like one of those publications that I enjoy reading, but like it's one of those like long form type of reporting that like I have to set aside time to like reading their articles because I know it's gonna really exercise, my brain, and they're generally pretty long, but they're really thorough. So I love that. What's that like, kind of working alongside ProPublica?
It's a dream. It's actually when I was applying for the fellowship and reflecting on how I became a journalist, I realized that I really had like one moment where I went to a talk by a woman who had been featured in a radio program, and she was like a whistleblower at the Federal Reserve, and she she shared her story, and it lots of impact. And I was like, oh, I could do this sort of journalism, but in the radio format that I love. And like, that was the moment for me and made me realize like, this is what I'm going to do. And it's going to be this more investigative bent. And I always remembered that it was a This American Life story, which is true, but it turns out it was a co-production with ProPublica. And so I was like, oh, that's a beautiful kind of full circle moment that it was a ProPublica story that made me want to be an investigative journalist. So it's really a dream to work with them. And it's a totally different caliber of maybe not reporting, but certainly of editing. It's been really fun, intense edits. And you said that, you have to set time aside. The initial draft was like 8,000 words, and we got it down to, I think, 3,500. So there was just like, as long as the final product was, it was so much longer, and there was so much work put into trying to condense our findings and synthesize them so that people didn't get lost, and people, were able to come away with the real takeaways, because not everyone has the time or the bandwidth or the interest.
So true. So yeah, we were fortunate enough to have we had Andy Kroll on the show on a couple of different occasions. One, he was doing a story about Barry Seed, and we talked to him about that. And then when he had his book, I can't remember, something on W Street, but it's all about the Seth Rich Pizzagate conspiracy. Really, really phenomenal book if you haven't read it. It was just such a privilege and honor to have him on. But anyways, you recently just did a story regarding a pastor that is known, or maybe not isn't known, but is very, very influential in GOP Republican type circles. So maybe give us sort of the high level overview of like what the story was all about.
Sure. So we told the story of Pastor Matthew Trewhella. He's known as Pastor Matt to his congregation, who in the 90s was one of the nation's most militant, considered extremist anti-abortion activists. He was known for calling for churches to form militias, for defending the murder of abortion providers as justifiable homicide. And he and his group would blockade clinics. Sometimes they would bring cars to the front of abortion clinics and then chain themselves to the cars so that it would take the fire department sometimes 5-6 hours in order to remove them. And it disrupted, the care going on in the clinic. And he was sort of roundly, observed as this. The FBI would not confirm or deny this, but it was reported that he was investigated as part of a national anti-abortion violence conspiracy in 1994, sort of on a watch list. So this was his reputation in the 90s and early 2000s. Flash forward to 2013, he comes out with a book called The Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates, which took this 16th century Protestant idea, Protestant resistance theory, and he recast it for modern day America, saying that this is appropriate to use today. And it came out sort of in the rise of the Tea Party, this moment before Trump and the MAGA movement, and exploded, particularly with the COVID-19 pandemic and people looking for ways to resist COVID measures. And so fast forward to today in 2024, he is steadily gaining influence on the right. He has found embrace in some mainstream GOP circles. We found him supported or cited by Republicans as local as school board and county commissioner, all the way up to former members of the Trump administration, and sort of all the levels in between. And what he's known for today, instead of his anti-abortion extremism, is going around the country saying, hey, there's a 16th century Protestant doctrine. It's biblical, it's historical, and it allows you, county commissioner, governor, state lawmaker, whomever, sheriff is a big one. It empowers you to defy or actively resist, if necessary, any law, policy, or court opinion that is deemed unjust or immoral under God's law. And so for him, it's all, civil law governmental law is superseded by God's law and a very particular type and interpretation of what God's law is.
That's so wild. I mean, like, what initially drew you to investigate Pastor Matt and explore kind of that relationship between his hermeneutics, theological doctrine, whatever you want to call it, and Republican politics?
Yeah, I came at it in a totally different way, and this is one of the beautiful things about being a local reporter and seeing stories develop over time, or seeing the same people kind of show up, and also an investigative reporter, because back in October of 2022 is when he first came onto my radar, because I was working on a story about the sort of anti-LGBTQ moral panic that was really starting to pick up around that time and has since sort of bloomed. And there was a dust up because Matt Walsh, who's a self-described Christo-fascist, came to UW-Madison. There were pro-LGBTQ people protesting Matt Walsh. There were other people who were protesting the protesters or in support of Matt Walsh. And Trewhella's church was among those who were in support of Walsh and speaking against LGBTQ people. And there was sort of an altercation that got national, international news. And people were kind of anticipating or kind of assuming that these counter protesters who were anti-LGBTQ were also part of UW-Madison. The event was at UW-Madison because they were young people. And I was one of the only reporters who actually just went over like across the green to go talk to them and be like, who are you? Where are you from? Oh, you're not from UW-Madison. Oh, many of you aren't in school. You're around college age, but you're married and you are street preachers and you come from this church. And so I started looking into the church. I had just read a book, The Power Worshippers by Catherine Stewart, where she talks a lot about Christian nationalism and dominionism. And I was able to hear in my conversations with some of these people, oh, they're talking about dominionism. They're dominionists. They want, they believe that their vision of God's kingdom and Christ's kingdom needs to be imposed on all aspects of society. I just did a couple Google searches and realized who Pastor Trewhella was and his background. Also noticed he wasn't at that event, but his son-in-law and evangelist at the church, Jason Storms, was there. Storms had filmed himself on the scaffolding of the Capitol at January 6th, saying that this was sort of like a second American Revolution. I'm paraphrasing there. I don't remember exactly what it's saying, but I was like, this is really interesting. So kind of paid attention. And then that church got more involved with anti-LGBTQ protesting across the year, including at an event where there were neo-Nazis protesting a pride event. They were there kind of not necessarily like aligned with the Nazis, but also were saying anti-LGBTQ things and causing a dust up. And so they kept getting featured in local news, but just as kind of contextless activists, not with sort of this broader thing. And so I really first wanted just people to realize like, hey, there's this history. This is where it comes from, this is the history of that. And then digging more deeply, my editors were kind of like, okay, why do we care? Why do we care now? And I dug a little deeper and realized, oh, he's having an influence today too. And isn't that so much more interesting given where he came from and this shift where he once was sort of considered a pariah and now is being embraced. And he hasn't changed that much. So what happened in between to allow sort of the right to embrace him in this way now? So that's the long of
it. That's great. Yeah. Catherine Stewart's pretty amazing. We were lucky to have her on the show at least 3 or 4 times. We actually have her coming back on here in a little while to talk about Project 2025. And her book is great. The Power Worshippers. It's really, really good. I guess what's kind of the reach of Pastor Matt? Is he from Wisconsin? And what, talk about his church a little bit, if you could.
Sure. So he was born and raised in Detroit, and he sort of describes his coming of age as one where he was a white minority in a predominantly Black space. And there's in his conversion testimony, there's lots of sort of racial animus where he's viewing himself as sort of an oppressed minority. He then landed in, he had some legal trouble as a child or adolescence, landed in an evangelical rehab program at 17, which is when he had his conversion to Pentecostalism, evangelicalism. And I'm not sure what brought him to Wisconsin, but he graduated from Valley Forge Christian College, which is in I think Phoenixville. It's in Pennsylvania. And then he and his wife, who was also from Detroit, landed in the Milwaukee area and founded a church. And so the church is Mercy Seat Christian Church, founded in 1990. And it's a non-denominational church, but Protestant and clearly Reformed in its persuasions. And what's interesting, he's got this evangelical background, evangelical Assemblies of God college and the evangelical rehab program. The church, super interesting to look at the church on the Wayback Machine, the Internet Archive, because it shows what their commitments were even back, in the 90s. And there were the books that they sold. I had this in the story. I think we cut it, but I loved this. The books that were sold at the church back when were a book on saving seeds and kind of prepping, the Second Amendment and forming militias, Christian courtship. There was a sovereign citizen inspired health manual. There was a novel by a tax protester and neo-Confederate activist, and then there was something by the Weavers who at the Ruby Ridge standoff. And so that kind of, to me, really captured what their commitments were, because Pastor Trewhella will say, if you want to understand what we believe, just read the catechism on the website. We don't fit into a theological box. But they were, linking to Reformed groups. And a lot of it was Second Amendment rights. And so the Second Amendment and sort of militias and whatnot was built into the fabric of the church. So Milwaukee area since the 90s. But you asked about his reach. Now it's national and in fact international. So I found newspaper articles where he was being quoted and kind of described as this anti-abortion extremist in Canada in the 90s and 2000s. And then last year, certainly, he was in Northern Ireland sharing his doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates for several days. And we have seen him sort of travel across the country speaking about his doctrine, a lot of it in the Midwest, but then we saw people, quoting him in Florida, in Tennessee, in Indiana, kind of all over the place. But I will say one thing I should add is that when I first was talking to, I found some researchers, including one, Frederick Clarkson, who had been studying him since the 90s. And one of the things he said, the first thing that Clarkson said to me was that Wisconsin is home to one of the most influential thought leaders on the far right post January 6th, like nationally. And he's here in Wisconsin's backyard, and very few people know about him. And so the influence of him is kind of it's multi-layered and nuanced, but a lot of it is just this behind the scenes thought leader development, which is why a lot of people don't know of him, or might have heard about the anti-abortion stuff, but don't realize that he's having an influence today in these other ways.
I guess what's like his evolution of his prominence. I mean, being that he seems to be kind of like this, I don't know, this major player kind of behind the scenes, but with his rise, I mean, something had to have, I don't know, like led to people saying, hey, this is a guy that we like, and we want to listen to what he has to say.
Yeah, so I think it's two major things. One is something that he did, and the other is just societal cultural. So the first is that he published a book, and the book, he did some serious research for the book. Like, he described to me in an interview going to the Library of Congress. And in his telling, the librarians at the Library of Congress were very interested in what he was doing, because everyone else was doing topics that everyone had heard of. This was something new. He also, for the book, commissioned the first ever full English translation of this 1550s Protestant text from the original Latin to English. Like, there was some real kind of scholarly work involved. And so researchers I've spoken to have described writing a book like this that draws on history in this way, even though academics will say this history is misused or misinterpreted, misapplied. It's an act of credentialing, right? It takes you from this sort of fiery street preacher to now a learned man of influence and erudition who has a book that you're able to show, and it seems more. I've got the book right here, right? It seems more legitimate and persuasive, and it's something that you can sort of pass along to people and leave and whatnot, and build something off of. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is timing. As I said, it came out in 2013. This is the heyday of the Tea Party movement. In 2015, he goes to speak to the Montana state legislature for their election sermon in the rotunda of the Montana Capitol. And he's talking about his book, but what he's saying is like straight out of the Tea Party playbook, right? It's all of the same ideas about railing against the federal government, lower taxation. Americans are being stripped of their rights and individual liberties because of the excesses of federal government. And it just kind of, it keeps building with Trumpism and the MAGA movement and the sort of like freedom patriot movement. But his profile really exploded with the COVID-19 pandemic. We were able to see, I found data from like podcast websites that track, that aggregate various shows and appearances and whatnot. And we saw his appearances just explode in 2020. So he was like here and there, whatever. And then 2020 pandemic hits, and he's on the scene so much more. And we found Facebook posts where he was saying, in light of the tyrannical acts from the federal government, we are going to double down on our activism and get the word out about the doctrine of the lesser magistrates so much more. And that's in April of 2020. And so this moment happened where people were looking for ways to resist pandemic precautions that people deemed restrictive. And he had answers for them. And he also hustled really hard to make sure that he was out there in public, giving interviews, passing out literature, speaking at events in order to share that message, to provide people with answers. And that's sort of how how that happened. And of course, with the rise of the Tea Party movement and MAGA and all of this, one of the underlying themes of what we're speaking about is just the shifting of the Overton window for the right, like that politics in this nation have moved rightward. I'm putting my hands left, but it should be the other way. But never very good with my left and right directionally, but they moved for the right so that this becomes less extreme and more palatable, and it's less on the margins, and it's more kind of closer to what people are receptive to.
Interesting. So this book, it's, what is it called? The Doctrine of Lesser Magistrates?
The Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates.
Got it. So I guess maybe we can start there first. Like, what does the title like mean?
Yeah, so it's almost an eponymous title. So the Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates is the title of the book, and this doctrine, this theory that he's talking about. So the Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates, in Trewhella's definition, is that any government official has a God-given right and duty to defy law, policy, or court opinion deemed unjust or immoral under the law of God. And this comes from a 16th century Protestant idea, in Trewhella's telling, first formalized in a 1550 document called the Magdeburg Confession, written by a bunch of German Lutheran pastors. Other academics will say maybe it came from other places, but this is a genuine area of what scholars call Protestant resistance theory. And what it is like Protestants in the Protestant Reformation trying to decide, when is it okay to disobey authority and stand up for our convictions? So this is a time of religious war and oppression. So Protestants and Catholics sort of slaughtering each other, right? And government, church and state much more closely intertwined. And for years before that, the prevailing notion was, okay, Romans 13 says you have to obey, governmental authority. Like you have to obey it. And so the Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates comes out of this time of them saying, okay, well, circumstances have sort of changed. This doesn't seem tenable. When is it okay to resist? Is it okay to actively resist? Is it okay to possibly kill the king if he's asking us to, do things that are contrary to what God wants? And so people are really wrestling with this. I've spoken to scholars who have studied this throughout time, and they say this is like a legitimate, it's called Protestant resistance theory. And it was highly contested and complicated, and that Trewhella, he's drawing on something real, but that he vastly oversimplifies it to say this is the one thing that everyone has agreed on all throughout time. His definition is super simplistic and prescriptive. And the scholars I speak to will be like, well, to call it a doctrine is simplistic because that seems to, indicate that everyone has agreed on these tenets. And it was totally contested. But that's what he's drawing on, and that's what he's telling the world is like simple thing, that you can use. And the thing that's interesting to me when people talk about it, when government officials talk about it or party officials, they sometimes will lose Trewhella will sometimes drop the God's law, and it's just you have the ability to defy or actively resist something that's unjust or immoral. And so then you're allowed to sort of fill in the blanks of what that standard is. And like, oh, unjust or immoral, maybe that means unconstitutional. So if something's unconstitutional, maybe we shouldn't defy that. And like, that seems right? We're following the Constitution. But for him, it's God's law is the objective standard. The laws of the nation should reflect and mirror the laws of God. And of course, it's his very particular view of God's law that means very particular things for women, for people of color, for LGBTQ people. And it's a very narrow, specific worldview that then gets sort of disseminated amongst the masses.
Yeah. Have you ever read Andrew Seidel's book, American Crusader?
That's like the one. I haven't read his book, no, but it's on my list.
It's pretty amazing. So like, as you were talking about, this sort of God's law superseding, man's law, so to speak. I mean, his book really kind of goes into really, really great detail about all these different cases where, say like a woman is, gets caught speeding and she tells the officer, God told me I needed to drive really, really fast or something. And as a result, like, there's this like church state thing, like can the law prosecute somebody that, is using some divine, providence or something to justify behavior that is illegal in man's law. And the entire book is just littered with examples like that. And it'd be super interesting to have you read it and hear what you think about it, because it totally applies right now, like with what you're saying. But I'm curious, like, about so Trewhella's, like, he's obviously a person that has deep religious convictions, and it seems as if his infiltration into kind of the political world, will have, or is already having, some level of influence. So I'd love to kind of get your thoughts about, is that influence actually yielding, certain results that benefit both, the religious community and or like the Republicans as a whole?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know how to. Well, I will say, just, and I know we're simplifying, just talking off the cuff, but the religious community, I'm like, what does that mean? There's so many. I mean, that's sort of the whole thing with it, right? Is like when he says, well, this is what God's law said. I'm like, but who's right? And this is a pluralistic, multi-faith, But so I will say, so he has had various successes, political or legislative, that advance his aims. And for him, religion and politics are very intertwined, right? Like it seems that all he does is driven by his beliefs and his conception of what is right, and what is righteous. And so the successes he has fit that, like they're in harmony. And so we found that he's very interested, I should say, at the local level. He does not identify as a Christian Reconstructionist, but he's clearly drawing on them, and scholars say, he's clearly influenced by their ideas, and they consider the county the most biblical form of government. So he's super focused on the county and the local level. And that's one of the main things that he talks about often when he's doing this, is that this is and that's in line with the doctrine of the lesser magistrates. It's the lower magistrates, the lower local officials, sort of checking the power, though not in a constitutional way, of those who are higher. So he has influenced Second Amendment sanctuaries across the country. We found at least 10 that use the term lesser magistrates. And the first one that we found that used that term was written by a Cherokee County Commissioner, Dr. Dan Eichenbaum, who describes himself as a crusader for freedom and a crusader for the Constitution. Eichenbaum said that reading Trewhella's book was a turning point for him in his governance, and that it taught him how to be the quote unquote big brother that his constituents needed him to be. And so after he reads the book, he writes the Second Amendment Sanctuary Resolution. Wasn't the first in the country. It comes out in 2019. But his version, that's sort of riding this national wave, is influenced by Trewhella's book and cites it in the document itself, saying that lesser magistrates have this authority, and have a duty to enact it on behalf of the people. And then in his telling, and then corroborated by our reporting, his version of the resolution gets copied in county over county. in various states, so up to 10. So that's one area. And these are, mostly symbolic until the rubber hits the road, and we'll see what happens. We found that Andy Ogles, who was then the mayor of Maury County, Tennessee, I might be butchering that pronunciation, invoked the doctrine when he took measures to allow unvaccinated healthcare workers to keep their jobs, and to, there was some like federal Medicaid CMS ruling that said that if you're unvaccinated, you can't keep your job. And he explicitly invoked the doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates when he took that step. We also found, as another example, that the Missouri Senator Mike Moon had a website back in 2017 or so that was like covered with Trewhella language and iconography, like links to his website, his logos, a whole thing about the doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates and what you're called to do as a legislator. And he has introduced a couple of things that have not been successful, but are clearly in that spirit. One is the Second Amendment law, I believe. The other one was a bill that would have completely abolished abortion. And this is when Roe versus Wade was still the law of the land. And it said basically, screw what the Supreme Court says. We're going to introduce this bill that is superseding the authority of the Supreme Court. So clearly influenced by Trewhella. They have spoken together. They've had conferences together and whatnot. And then the other thing that I always like to bring up as an interesting example of spread and influence. So this is not Trewhella himself. This is someone taking up the mantle and being inspired by the sort of thought work that he's putting out there. There's a prominent activist who promotes sort of baseless, debunked election conspiracies, claiming the 2020 election was stolen. He's gone on a nationwide tour, 29 states, I believe, 55 stops, where he says that the voting machines are inherently rigged and untrustworthy, and that local officials should refuse to certify results or refuse to use the machines. And the jump is that he says that this is all based on the doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates and Trewhella's book, and that this should empower these local officials to do this. So that's an example of where someone else is taking this up and using it to other ends that certainly benefit a faction of the right, if not the Republican Party, although it's been folks on the Republican Party who have been the ones claiming that the election was stolen, which there's no evidence of that. So yeah.
That's so wild. So like, is he still preaching? And if so, like, what's the general disposition of like his congregation? I mean, are they? I mean, in a time where it seems like church attendance is low, and pastors are becoming more political, I'm thinking like the Robert Jeffersons of the world. Like, what's his congregation like?
Yeah. So I will preface this by saying that I have never attended a church event in person. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that, so I have to wear a mask. I have to wear a respirator inside public places, because I'm high risk for COVID complications. My partner is immunocompromised and disabled. And Trewhella is virulently anti-mask and has said something to the effect of people who wear masks are perpetuating a great evil. And so there's some real like hostility there. And perhaps some safety concerns, right? We didn't want to I'm not able to just sort of like be a fly on the wall and observe in a way that wouldn't draw attention and maybe kind of disrupt the flow of things. That said, his congregation, from what I can tell, especially from going to events, a big contingent is his family. So he's got a huge family, upwards of 30 grandchildren. I don't know the exact number. And he's got 11 children. They tend to marry young and have lots of children. And that's part of sort of their faith and being sort of godly citizens. And it seems that people are really behind him. The people who go really love him. I've spoken to folks who, and this is secondhand, but have said, I know people who went to the church and it wasn't for them. But the church is quite sort of extreme. One thing we talk about in the story is that he tempers his message and his presentation depending on what audience he's speaking to. So when he's speaking to Republican parties or lawmakers, he's very calm, he's very congenial, he's cracking jokes, he's very erudite, and then he's quite fire and brimstone and yells in his church services, and has high expectations of his church membership. So there's one thing I'm thinking about in particular where he was just railing against other so-called Christians who are kind of dopes, who bring their children to government schools instead of homeschooling them, and that it's just ridiculous to think that you would have the ability to witness, that your child would be able to witness to the other students. Because by sending them to the school, you're perpetuating that. And instead, the godly thing to do is just to homeschool your children. And he was quite caustic when describing that. And so I can imagine that might be alienating. Or he'll describe people who just want to go to church just on Sunday and that's their time to worship. And then they kind of leave it at the church house door and they kind of go about their life and it's not as pious or virtuous as it should be. And so it seems as though he has quite high expectations for his congregation. We had a brief, everyone's been very polite when we've gone to kind of report on people or report on protests and whatnot. But I was with a colleague, a member of his church said, she loves it because it's biblical. Most churches are not. She asked if we were Christians. My colleague volunteered that she's Catholic. And this congregant immediately said, "Oh, well, I would consider that a false religion," which was seems like a telling sort of response.
Oh my gosh, I'm like just wrapping my head around all his kids and grandkids. I wonder how many catless, childless kids he has or grandkids he has.
I'm not sure. I'm very interested in that dynamic, but it hasn't been part of the reporting. I'm hoping people will want to perhaps speak to me about that. But it is interesting that, so he talks a lot about this on social media and in his sermons about, so he's had 11 children. If all of his children have 10 or 11 children, you do the math. Eventually, he'll be able to develop a nation, and he'll hearken that to figures in the Bible who are able to sort of populate entire nations based on their progeny. And he has sermons where it very much indicates his vision of the family, which is patriarchal, which he happily accepts. And it also seems to be very he'll describe. It's very centered around himself and his wife. And then, the families that his children have, ultimately they answer to the grandfather and grandmother, right? As opposed to breaking off into their own nuclear family. He'll give sermons about a son or a son-in-law or a daughter or daughter-in-law might be trying to challenge the authority of the ultimate father and mother, and how that's sinful. Which is just interesting coming from a different culture and context, thinking but if they're adults in their own right and have their own children, maybe, anyway, it's a whole other tangent. But
yeah, you mentioned earlier sort of this connection to dominionism, and I would love for you to kind of elaborate. I mean, we've covered, discussed dominionism, and even more broadly, the Seven Mountain Mandate or the Seven Spheres of Influence. Had Matthew Taylor, Andre Gagné, some of the leading voices on this. So can you talk a little bit more about how does the Doctrine of Lesser Magistrates connect or relate to dominionism?
Yeah, so I think where it intersects is that one, it's context. It comes from a history, or it comes from a time where church and state were intertwined, and there wasn't quite this separation, and so it made more sense that what God's law is would affect what the sort of quote unquote civil law is, and I think dominionism is theocratic, right? I mean, theocracy in a particular sense of the word, and that we tend to think of it as this is the laws of the government being influenced by the laws of the Bible or religion or whatever, and in that sense of dominionism and the doctrine of the lesser magistrates, they're both theocratic, that God's law or this religious precept should govern and define what's happening in the government, which in the United States of America should be a secular, pluralistic, multicultural society. So Trewhella had this conference that's online, all of these talks branded as sort of TED Talk style missives, where it's called County Before Country, and the tagline for that is expanding God's kingdom through Christian localism, which I think gives away the game pretty clearly. Like, the idea is to expand their vision of what God's kingdom is on all of society, but first off by these discrete sort of pockets of governance, the county. And yeah, for him, there's no separation between the Constitution and the Bible, or his vision of what the Bible is. I asked him about, like, well, what do you do with the Establishment Clause or the separation between church and state? And he's like, oh, those aren't really real, right? Like, the Establishment Clause, like, there's a difference, they'll say things, he and others will say things like, well, that relates to like an established church, like the church of the crown or the kingdom of Great Britain. But, obviously Christian values, or my version of Christian values, should influence and prescribe what the laws are. I'm really long-winded answer. I apologize, but it's one and the same. It can be used as a tool of dominionism or of theocracy, certainly. And that was one of the things we were hoping to illustrate with the story, because of the way Trewhella will use the American context and like American revolutionary history to justify using the doctrine of the lesser magistrates. He'll paint it in sort of this cloak of patriotism and almost secularism, or like the civil religion of like the myth of the American founding, and will say this is totally valid to use today. But where it comes from, where Trewhella wants to bring it, is entirely theocratic. And so it's unclear to me how many people who are using this when they are county commissioners, or like Andy Ogles, for example, in Tennessee, now congressman, how aware they are that this is a tool of theocracy and that this is a religious rule, or religious idea. It's not entirely clear. So part of the hope of the story was connecting those dots for people. It's like, okay, well, when you're using this isn't just something that you're using from American history that's like a constitutional tool. This is a very particular religious tool that has a religious worldview attached to it, that we should think about whether or not that is appropriate for use in a multicultural, multi-faith, pluralistic, but ultimately secular democracy, constitutional republic.
Well, it's so wild. The you mentioned that the doctrine is sort of largely based on some 16th century understanding of biblical, I don't know, subservience. Maybe that's not the right word, but just some sort of 16th century doctrine that he's sort of extrapolating, creating this book, trying to press it upon sort of Western culture. Like, does Trewhella have like any historical figures that he also kind of looks upon, that kind of helps guide or shape his outlook of pluralism, politics, like obedience, stuff like that?
Yeah. So I would say that so often in his sermons and in his writings to more sort of specialized audiences, he will talk about other sort of religious figures or thinkers. Certainly he'll talk about Calvin and Luther and John Salisbury or of Salisbury and John Panay and all these other people. But in his book and in his more in his talks to more generalized audiences, county commissioners, county Republican parties and whatnot, he'll draw on the American founding and he'll say that this is something that the framers themselves used. And he'll specifically talk about James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry. And I talked to half a dozen scholars about this. So, and I took great pains to ensure that half of the scholars that I spoke to were self-identified conservative Christians and also academics, so that they couldn't just be dismissed reflexively as secular leftists who were disagreeing because they disagreed with his political ends. So they share some of the same commitments or ideals, and all but one across the board of these half a dozen said, Trewhella's historical claims are baseless and without evidence. So, 6 out of the 7 people that we spoke to. So, for example, he will talk about the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions that Madison and Jefferson wrote. And the scholars I spoke to are like, they're saying different things with this. And, maybe some of that was, he'll quote other things like that was before the Constitution was established, right? Like he'll talk about the Declaration of Independence, which is an important founding document, but it's before the constitutional regime. And so it's part of our history, but it's not part of like the legal structure that we use to govern our society today. So that's one of the big things. He'll use kind of those archetypes and he'll say, oh, well, they talked about it, but they talked about it as nullification or interposition. There's no evidence that they were drawing on specifically the doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates in that, although they, surely would have been well read, might have been familiar with it. I spoke to someone, again, conservative Christian scholar, who said, he claimed to have read every single sermon that is documented from like this revolutionary era of ministers from that time period. He's like, I didn't find anyone citing this. And you would think that, that someone at the time would have mentioned it in a sermon if it was relevant, and it just didn't come up. One of the other things that I find really interesting that was a section of the story, and editors felt like it was too much of a departure and I wasn't able to summarize it in a elegant and succinct way, is that this use of nullification and interposition in that particular history in the U.S. So Trewhella will say nullification and interposition, that's the doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates, and that's where it is in our history. He'll often talk about Wisconsin's defiance of the Fugitive Slave Act as an example of the doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates, saying that this is something that's righteous and appropriate and morally good. And it's an effective tool, right? Because, most people are like, slavery was morally repugnant. And that's one of those times when it makes sense to, to say kind of like, this is what the law says, but this is what's morally right. What's interesting, though, is that historically, nullification and interposition in the United States of America was far more often deployed in favor of slavery as a means of protecting that vile institution instead of challenging it. And that's kind of the real history of nullification and interposition in the United States in the antebellum period and onward is defending the institution of slavery. So morally repugnant ends. But he'll focus on the one time where it was used for something that modern day folks would say, well, that's like, that's morally defensible. So it's a, I don't know what it tells us about history, but it's an incredibly effective rhetorical strategy, I think.
Yeah. I mean, also given kind of the influence of Trewhella's like ideology, and his writing, like what or who have you found has either taken elements of his doctrine, promoted his book, like who of significance, especially as we kind of, really kind of get into the presidential election, like, who in sort of that upper echelon of politics is promoting this kind of stuff?
So explicitly, retired Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, who was briefly former President Trump's national security advisor, also is a big QAnon conspiracy proponent. General Mike Flynn has called Trewhella's book a masterful blueprint, something that basically every patriot should read. He's promoted it several times. Another one is Jenna Ellis, who was a member of Trump's 2020 campaign team, facing, I think she pleaded guilty. I'm not sure, but she, got into legal trouble for attempting to overturn the 2020 election. She cited it in a 2015 book, saying that this is a possible way to develop a moral constitution. And in her version, the book Moral Constitution meant one that did not endorse or enshrine gay marriage. And another one that we found talking about this was William Wolf, who was a low-level Trump administration official. I think now with the SEC, he is a self-described, self-avowed Christian nationalist, and has cited it and the definition approvingly in a blog post that was kind of endorsing Governor Greg Abbott's border standoff when he was defying the federal government. And Wolf wrote that this was an example of Abbott working as sort of a godly lesser magistrate. So those are some of the big ones in the political sphere that we were able to identify. Some state lawmakers, and senators and things like that, or congressmen, thinking of Ogles. But Michael Flynn is kind of the big one. And we also found, that the that election activist or so-called election integrity activist who promotes conspiracy theories, this Greater Magistrates tour that he had across the country. At one point, Steve Bannon and Mike Lindell made an appearance at that event. I was able to speak with Mike Lindell by phone, and he's like, "I don't know what the Lesser Magistrates is. I just went up. I just did my thing, But so, not to say that they are promoters of this idea, but they're in the same circles, right? They were appearing at events that were explicitly based on, or at an event that was explicitly based on this idea.
Oh, that's so wild. And I was thinking earlier when you were talking about the dominionism aspect, is like that's something that is widely promoted, by folks like Lance Wallnau, Charlie Kirk, about getting folks activated at the local level, be on school boards or to whatever, so that way they can kind of see the fruition of this dominionism, in all the sectors, like the media, the entertainment, government, stuff like that. So I'd love to kind of get your thoughts, your opinion about like what are you looking for, as far as this doctrine, this ideology making its way in a much greater capacity in this election? Like, what are some of the things that you're looking for to kind of see if this influence is spreading or not?
So the thing that I'm most laser focused on leading up to 2024 is if this Greater Magistrates tour is successful in having an effect on delaying or withholding certification of votes. So that's kind of the biggest thing for me right now is, will there be a demonstrable effect at disrupting the 2024 election? And will anyone be saying specifically, this is my duty as a lesser magistrate, I'm called to act in this way? I think because that in the next few months is where I can foresee it being most disruptive and perhaps damaging to our democracy. But I'm interested for wherever it shows up, because it's just, it addresses, it kind of latches on to so many different realms or contentions in this sort of period. So I mentioned the county before country talks before, and just to give an example of these spheres or dominionism, right? Like they're talking about homeschooling. And, abolishing the government schools. They're talking about food security and developing sort of like Christian economies. They're talking about creating Christian medical structures. And so it's really kind of like, these are all of the spheres. Can we set up our own kind of separate, theologically driven or religiously driven, alternative societies that are kind of separate and are governed by this worldview. And so I'd be particularly interested in, what's happening in that medical sphere. What does that look like? What effects does that have on the patients who go there, perhaps, especially children who might not have a choice in where their parents send them to get medical attention, and what is the quality of that care? But certainly in the next, in the next few months, it's what effect does this have on the election?
So no talk so far about Pastor becoming a spiritual advisor to Donald Trump or anything?
I haven't seen anything like that. No, no connection to Trump beyond, people sort of in his orbit. And in fact, one of the things that's interesting to me about Trewhella is that he, some members of his family are unsure whether they're going to vote for Trump because he's insufficiently dogmatic or insufficiently committed to abortion abolitionism and to anti-LGBTQ issues. And so, he would not consider himself a partisan. I don't know if he voted for Trump. I know that he's always been, committed at this local level and saying, forget about the national level, focus on the local level, because that's where you can have impact. And so that's one of the things that I have wanted to impart upon people reading this. And just in general, right? People are like, okay, we got to focus on the 2024 election. That's the big one. Some people on the left will say, well, if the left manages to win the election, then the threat of theocracy, Christian nationalism, authoritarianism has disappeared. And that's just not true. One, it'll just move back to the 2028 election, but also there's a ground game at the local level to continue to pay attention to. And so I think that's where I'm going to be trying to, keep my focus, because that stuff can kind of be overlooked.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Phoebe. How can people follow you, read your work, get into what it is you're doing?
Yeah, they can subscribe to our various newsletters at wisconsinwatch.org. That's wisconsinwatch.org. That's my main home, my newsroom and outlet. I'll have more stories for the next year and a half now. Everything I report will be published by ProPublica as well. So ProPublica.org, both great nonprofit, nonpartisan, independent news outlets. So that's the best place to reach me and find my work. And I also, regrettably, am on Twitter, and I'm trying to be on it less. But that's just my name, at Phoebe Petrovic.
Got it. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been a really, really good conversation, and I've learned so much. And just thank you for just the work that you're doing. Like I said earlier, it's I'm sure being a journalist is a thankless profession, but there are people out there that are very pro journalists, and I'm one of them. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It means a lot to hear that. I appreciate it.
And to our listeners and watchers, thanks for stopping by. And again, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care.